The Rolling Stones are rock and roll.
An institution, pure and simple.
There was like modernism, romanticism, and Rolling Stonesism, the so-called greatest rock and roll band in the world.
The Rolling Stones were the original bad boys.
And as a child, I can remember my parents actually saying to me, "You don't want to end up like that."
They were started by a gifted musician who was on a downward spiral from the start.
He wanted to be the leader, and he couldn't be of no band with Mick Jagger in it.
The Stones became the vanguard of cultural rebellion.
The cops moved in and arrested everybody for possession of drugs.
Transformed rock music.
Those riffs are the basis of almost all rock and roll after them.
And staged one of the defining moments of the 1960s.
Here was Mick thinking he was going to outdo Woodstock.
Instead of 3 days of peace and love, it was a night of nightmares and death.
Nothing to lose.
Leads you to where you are today.
I believe in storytelling.
It's gonna make you a star.
I'm still trying to figure that out.
On April 28, 1963, a new blues cover band, the Rolling Stones, signed with a manager named Andrew Loog Oldham. For nearly a year, the Stones had played small clubs around London. But now, Oldham had bigger plans for the band.
Every band needs a Svengali, and I think Andrew Loog Oldham was the guy who took an R&B band, essentially, and spun them.
Oldham immediately got the band a recording contract with Decca Records and began booking tours and TV appearances. On June 7, 1963, the Stones released their first single, a Chuck Berry cover called Come On. But Oldham was just getting started.
Andrew Oldham, the genius of him, was he recognized that the time was right for rebellion. We were at the cusp of the 60s now. There was the beginning of Bohemia on a mass level. And so he saw Mick's lips, he saw Mick's hips, he realized the droogy potential of Keith and Brian, and Oldham, recognizing the way things were going in the 60s, was like, play that up. Play up the androgyny. Play up the delinquency.
Oldham had a vision for the band as the tough and sexually suggestive flip side to the Beatles. He dressed them in leather, had singer Michael Jagger call himself Mick, and played up their bad boy image.
They were pulling bigger crowds. The excitement level rose. Cops pushed them. They pushed back. They went all over Europe. Riots ensued. The press picked up on it. They fanned the flames. The hair got longer. And then the record sales increased.
Their circle of fans followed them everywhere. The fans screamed, chased them, and ripped off their clothes.
What about these girls I think it was in Manchester the other night, a couple of girls threw themselves from the balcony on the floor. Well, why do they do it? Is it a sort of sex thing, or?
Yes, it's sexual, completely.
It's hard to imagine that just 3 years earlier, future Rolling Stones icons Mick Jagger and Keith Richards were just two average teenagers in Dartford, England. They were 17 when they had a chance meeting on a train platform.
Keith Richards saw Mick Jagger with an armful of albums under his arm.
Growing up in the same town, Keith and Mick had known each other since they were 7, but their lives had taken different paths. Mick was going to the London School of Economics, while the more working-class Keith went to art school. There, Keith picked up his first guitar and fell in love with the blues.
Keith, he saw Mick with these albums, and he's like, hey, mate, like, you know, I haven't seen you in a while. And they started talking, and they said, look what I've got here, Chuck Berry, you know, Bo Diddley.
Naturally, Keith latched onto him, started borrowing his records, and that's still the basis of their friendship.
Keith had found someone who loved the blues as much as he did. Keith and Mick started playing together and going out to music clubs. One night in April 1962, they went to a club in Ealing, west of London, to hear the band Blues Incorporated, led by blues musician Alexis Corner. Late that night, a 20-year-old guitar player came on stage and started to play. His name, Brian Jones.
Brian started to play the slide guitar, which had never really been heard live in England before. And in the back of the room is Mick and Keith, and it blew them away.
Brian was basically rebelling against everything, you know, his middle-class background, and on a musical level, the really white pop. He was into something much more exotic, which was black, Southern, R&B.
Louis Brian Hopkins Jones had grown up in the middle-class town of Cheltenham. A musical prodigy and troublemaker, he was desperate to leave his provincial hometown.
He had maybe 2 or 3 children by the time he was 20. Every year or so, he had to leave town because the parents of the girls he was getting pregnant were, you know, coming after him with shotguns.
So by the time he got to, we started playing in the clubs, you know, he had kind of a reputation as being a hellraiser.
Brian moved to London without a penny, determined to start one of the first blues bands in England. He placed an ad for musicians in a jazz magazine.
The first person who showed up at the rehearsal hall wasn't Mick or Keith. It was a big, strong piano player called Ian Stewart, and he was a specialist in boogie-woogie. He was really in the Rolling Stones before Mick and Keith were.
Keith started playing with Brian and Ian Stewart, and he was able to persuade Mick to come sing and play harmonica. But the band remained unofficial until one night in July 1962, when Alexis Corner asked them to fill in at his new London music club, the Marquee. They suddenly needed a name, and in desperation, Brian came up with the Rolling Stones, taken from a Muddy Waters song.
In those years, unquestionably, Brian was the leader. He came up with the name, and he was also the established musician. Mick and Keith could have been one of a million kids in England. He was the catalyst, really, for their complete absorption in the musician's way of life.
The band struggled to find an audience, but England didn't yet know what to make of their music.
The clubs back then, they were sort of rock and roll clubs, hangovers from the older days, and Stones didn't play those places. They were playing at these traditional jazz venues. People didn't like them at first, you know, but that's the only places they could play.
At first, nobody would come see them.
While Brian, Mick, and Stu crashed in a squalid flat in Edith Grove, the Stones were slowly able to get enough gigs to stay alive. And they added 2 new band members, drummer Charlie Watts and bassist Bill Wyman.
The element that the Rolling Stones had more than anything was the rhythm section. The Rolling Stones would not have been the band that they were without the good fortune to land Bill Wyman and Charlie Watts.
Finally, the Rolling Stones were fully formed. Watts on drums, Stu on piano, Wyman on bass, Mick on harmonica and vocals, and Brian and Keith on guitar. With their new fuller sound, in February of 1962, the Stones managed to get a weekly gig at the Crawdaddy Club in the Station Hotel in Richmond.
It started out with maybe 10 people, and then the next weekend there were 20 people, and the next weekend there were 80 people, and the weekend after that there was 500 people trying to get into the club.
This guy told me about him. He said, oh, yeah, there's this great blues band. Now, I pictured black men from America, old black men. And I heard them before I went in, and they were fantastic. You know, I walked in, and there was these 6 white guys. The front row were all people in other bands, all young kids like me, thinking we can do it.
It was so packed, people couldn't dance, so they just went up and down, their arms clasped to their sides, as this incredible sonic boom came rolling off the lip of the stage.
2 months after starting at the Crawdaddy Club, a pushy young man showed up at Brian, Mick, and Stu's Edith Grove flat and said he wanted to manage the band. They hit it off, and Andrew Lou Goldham became the band's manager.
Andrew Oldham had worked for the Beatles, and that's what he wanted, his own little hegemony.
Andrew saw tremendous star potential in Mick Jagger and hoped that gradually the band would rival the Beatles. But before they made a go at stardom, one of the original Rolling Stones would be booted out of the band.
There should only be 5 people in a pop group because that's really the highest that the kids can count.
You've gone beyond, beneath. Now go behind.
Space.
In the fall of 1963, the Rolling Stones were on the rise. Their new manager, Andrew Oldham, booked them on their first big national tour with the Everly Brothers and Bo Diddley. It was a success, but Oldham saw a much bigger future for the young band.
One day, Andrew Oldham looked at the Rolling Stones and he looked at the Beatles, and what was different was Ian Stewart, the piano player, who wasn't young, who wasn't thin, didn't have long hair. And Andrew Oldham's famous line is that there should only be 5 people in a pop group because that's really the highest that the kids can count.
Oldham convinced the band to fire Stu, and his transformation of the Stones into leather-clad bad boys had an instant effect. Their fans loved it. Peter Whitehead, a filmmaker hired by Oldham to make a short film on the Stones, witnessed their audiences up close.
I was on the side of the stage, and Mick said, "Do you want me to get the people up on the stage?" And I said, "Well, yes." I said, "You can." Within 30 seconds, he had 3 people on the stage. He just went to the edge and just pulled them in. There was a young boy who I filmed right in the front, just standing there, looking up, weeping, just saying, "Mick, Mick, Mick."
Melody Maker in 1964 had a headline that said, "Would your daughter go with the Rolling Stone?" And what that really spoke to was that for a lot of people, the Rolling Stones were dangerous, especially parents.
They looked like they hadn't washed, and they looked like they'd been taking an awful lot of drugs. And as a child, I can remember my parents actually saying to me, "You don't want to end up like that."
But the band's bad boy persona was working. In April 1964, their first album, called simply The Rolling Stones, went to #1. 3 months later, in July, they played in Blackpool, England, with typical Stones attitude.
There was this one guy who kept spitting at Keith, and Keith can't stand any booing or anything. He really takes it personally. Keith walks to the edge of the stage and kicks the guy in the head, and the place exploded. Those people just utterly destroyed all their equipment, and they tore up the seats.
As the Stones' popularity started to skyrocket, it became clear that the band owed much of its tremendous appeal to singer Mick Jagger's electric on-stage presence.
Mick was riveting. It didn't take a rocket scientist to figure out that Brian was not as interesting.
But guitarist Brian Jones refused to acknowledge Mick's growing power in the band.
Brian would say, once we really start making it, I'm going to stay in the top hotel and you guys are going to be in another hotel. And this made them furious. I don't want to give the wrong impression. Brian was quite a sweet person, really. He was just hard to be in a band with because he wanted to be the leader. And he couldn't be the leader of no band with Mick Jagger in it.
As Mick was starting to shine on stage, he and Keith were also taking more control behind the scenes. Up until this time, the Stones were mainly a blues cover band, but Oldham saw the success the Beatles were having writing their own songs. He encouraged Mick and Keith to do the same.
The legend, of course, is that he locked Mick Jagger and Keith Richards into a kitchen, and he says, "You can't come out until you've written a song." And a couple hours later, according to the legend, they came out with As Tears Go By.
The song became a hit, and Mick and Keith realized that they could be songwriters as well as musicians.
Oldham, why he centered on Mick and Keith is very interesting because Brian, although he was a very versatile musician, he played several instruments, he just could never finish anything.
He was completely different to the other two. Mick and Keith at that time were young, macho guys who were going out to take over the world, and Brian just wanted to be a pop star, just wanted to be loved and looked at and worshipped.
Later in 1964, the Stones went on their first U.S. tour. No one knew them at first, but by the time they returned in the fall, they had become stars. In fact, they caused such an intense reaction on The Ed Sullivan Show that Sullivan said he would never have them back. The Stones were now international pop stars. As their success increased, so did the pleasures of stardom.
This front line of Brian Jones, Keith Richards, and Mick Jagger was incredibly sexy. And the girls were learning how to scream at pop bands again, which hadn't happened since Elvis. When they would come to New York, for instance, thousands of girls would surround their hotel, the Warwick on 54th Street, and the cops would have to close 6th Avenue.
The randiest, as I understand, was Bill. He was an absolute athlete. The legend has it that during the first 2 years in America, Bill screwed like 200 and something women, and Brian 169, and Mick like 75, and Keith 6. Charlie was completely faithful to his wife and didn't partake in any road shenanigans other than the occasional drink.
Along with casual encounters, there would be glamorous relationships. Mick started seeing heiress and model Marianne Faithfull, the singer of his hit song, As Tears Go By.
Apparently, the first time he met her, he was an oaf. He spilled wine on her blouse, and she thought he was a lout. But Mick was able eventually to ingratiate himself with Marianne.
The Stones came off their U.S. tour by traveling the world in early 1965. Ireland, Australia, Singapore. On that tour, a girl came backstage in Paris, a stunning model with a North Italian accent and a German name. Anita Pallenberg was the girl Brian Jones would love for the rest of his short life. In 1965, the world was going through massive change. Vietnam, the Civil Rights Movement, and the Rolling Stones were right in the middle of the cultural transformation. While guitarist Brian Jones was busy living the life of a glamorous pop star, Mick Jagger and Keith Richards were coming into their own as songwriters, turning out hit after hit for the band.
Satisfaction, 19th Nervous Breakdown, Get Off My Cloud, and Paint It Black. You know, immediately some of the most recognizable rock songs of the 60s in succession.
Keith composed Satisfaction in a legendary moment of rock inspiration.
Satisfaction has probably the most instantly recognizable guitar riff in the history of rock and roll. Keith says he woke up one morning with the riff on a tape and didn't really remember putting it down.
And he didn't like the song. He took it in the studio and played it for them, and he wasn't compelled by it, but the others in the band certainly were.
Satisfaction quickly became a #1 hit and sped up the band's journey to superstardom.
Those riffs are the basis of almost all rock and roll after them. I mean, in a weird way, what Chuck Berry had done for them, they did for a million garage bands and, you know, on every continent of Earth.
Satisfaction became emblematic of the 60s culture. And the Stones began to indulge in another hallmark of the era: drugs.
They started out smoking hash joints and pot a little later. Cocaine came in 65, 66.
Brian used drugs more than the rest of the Stones, fueled by his relationship with the equally experimental Anita Pallenberg. After she'd met the Stones in Paris in 1965, Anita showed up at a concert in Munich. There, she and Brian spent their first night together and became a couple.
Here's Brian, you know, he's got his mod clothes, he's got his classic haircut, and now he's got the supermodel on his arm, and of course they get completely loaded together and have sex.
Brian said that Anita was the first girl he was ever serious about. But their relationship was difficult from the start.
The problem with Brian Jones was, which Brian Jones were you dealing with? Brian could be very loving and attentive toward Anita, but also very brutal. And Anita actually gave as good as she got.
Anita would go upside Brian's head and give him a black eye. I mean, she could whip his, you know, and that's not cool.
More than the others, Brian was harassed by London police and arrested for drug possession many times. But in fact, all the Stones were coming into greater conflict with British society. In one famous clash, in January of 1967, the Stones had a disastrous appearance on England's version of Ed Sullivan, the tame, middle-of-the-road London Palladium show.
The Palladium show was on Sunday night, and it was very British. And they had a roundabout stage, And everybody who'd been on the show got on the roundabout and waved at the audience. And Brian was on acid. He said, "I'm not getting on that freaking roundabout." And they didn't. And it was a huge deal.
Oldham called their behavior atrocious. It was one of the final straws in what had become a difficult relationship with their manager.
He just stormed out, you know, and that was the last they ever saw of him.
In 1967, Oldham broke with the band, and New York record mogul Alan Klein became the Stones' new manager.
They always hated their label, Decca. They got a lousy royalty rate, and Oldham represented this to them.
Andrew just didn't want the heartache. He wanted the money, and he wanted them to be show business. You know, he didn't want to change society.
But it seemed the Stones, so successfully launched by Oldham 4 years earlier, no longer needed their mastermind. They were now making some of the best music of their careers.
Beggars Banquet and Let It Bleed are the best albums they ever made. They embodied, more than anybody then, what rock and roll was at its best.
As the Stones became more famous, they became more threatening to British society. The conflict reached a new level on February 12, 1967, when Keith threw a party at Redlands, his country estate.
One weekend, Keith Richards decided to have an acid party at his house, and he invited George Harrison and his wife Patty, and Mick Jagger and his girlfriend Marianne Faithfull, and a bunch of their friends. Someone had tipped off the cops that there was going to be acid trips going on, and as soon as George Harrison and his wife had left the house, the cops moved in and arrested everybody for possession of drugs.
Mick and Keith each spent a night in jail before making bail.
Mick was very afraid. When they took him off to jail, he was in tears. Keith, there may be something Keith is afraid of, but I've never come across it. He told the judges that the Rolling Stones were not old men and they didn't have old men's petty morals.
The case dragged on for months, and there was real concern that Mick and Keith could serve serious jail time and spell the end of the Rolling Stones.
They only got out because one of their publicists got to the editor of the Times of London, which ran their famous editorial that said, "Who breaks a butterfly on a wheel?" How useless it was for the British government to persecute and prosecute rock stars.
After months of uncertainty, Mick and Keith were acquitted on appeal in late July 1967. The notoriety of their bust only heightened their fame.
All it did was make the Stones the most envied and looked at band of the 1960s. In rock and roll, it's a lifestyle to which you aspired. And the Stones were living it. They were it.
But this celebrated rock and roll lifestyle would soon lead one of the Stones on a downward spiral, from which he would never recover. By 1967, the Stones were world famous, but their excesses were threatening their status. In the aftermath of a highly publicized drug bust, guitarist Keith Richards and singer Mick Jagger decided to leave England for a time. Keith drove to Morocco and took guitarist Brian Jones and Brian's girlfriend Anita Pallenberg with him in his Bentley. But on the way there, Brian got sick with a respiratory infection and checked into a hospital in Toulon, France. Keith and Anita kept going.
So at that point, they leave. And as Keith has said, you know, since, he says, you know, a lot can happen in the back of like a car and a, you know, 5-hour drive or whatever. And at that point, there was no going back.
By the time the trip was over, Keith had stolen Brian's girlfriend of 2 years. Brian was despondent. When Keith and Anita started living together, Brian became increasingly erratic and unreliable, and his behavior was taking a toll on the band.
He started taking a lot more drugs, especially downers, and not showing up at Rolling Stones rehearsals.
You know, there were stories about he would trash his own apartment, or he'd go on binges where, you know, he'd pass out.
Brian Jones kept getting arrested for drugs. And in late 1969, Mick Jagger realized that the only way the Rolling Stones could really continue would be to go to the United States, play their new music, tour the country, and kind of take over the burgeoning rock movement. The problem was that Brian Jones couldn't get a visa.
Brian played on only 2 tracks of their classic 1968 album, Let It Bleed. And the Stones found they were becoming less and less dependent on Brian. His inspired channeling of American blues musicians was less necessary as the Stones moved into their own style of music.
I think the Stones came to a crossroads with Brian. They realized that at that moment in time, they were either going to be a group or a supergroup. And I think they thought that Brian was becoming a liability.
It ended with Jagger and Richards and Charlie Watts that visited his house and told him it was over.
On June 8, 1969, Brian Jones, who had organized the group 6 years earlier and given the band its name, was out of the Rolling Stones.
Charlie said he seemed relieved. He knew that nothing was working, you know. He'd lost his band, he'd lost his girl. You know, he was a loser.
To replace Brian, the band hired Mick Taylor, a young, talented guitarist.
Mick Taylor, he wasn't a wild card like Brian. He was an incredibly capable, schooled blues player. And I think that was a calculation on their part that that's what they needed.
Brian Jones had lost the band that had been his creation.
Brian Jones just seems like one of those people who was in some ways too troubled and delicate to survive the world. He had this hermetic environment with the Rolling Stones, and suddenly he was not even a part of it.
His sense of isolation after leaving the band that he had helped become a worldwide sensation must have left him completely rootless and at odds with himself and wondering why he was here in the first place.
Just a short time after Brian left the Stones, on July 2nd, 1969, tragedy struck.
He was living in the country, and he had a bunch of people working on the house. And one night they had a party, and no one really knows for sure what happened next.
Joe Bergman, their secretary, called me. It was like 2 o'clock in the morning, and it rang, I guess, maybe 20 times. And I thought, this must be serious. And I got up and answered it, and Joe said, Brian's dead.
The only thing that's really known is that close to midnight, Brian was found at the bottom of his swimming pool. The next morning, I think it was July 3rd, 1969, Brian Jones's death was announced.
Drowning was the cause of the death. As far as the inquests were concerned, it was an accidental death. Others felt that maybe it was sort of a self-willed death, a form of suicide. Because when you fall from that great a height, where do you go?
I think he'd been taking Mandrax, which is like Quaaludes, but he kept the pool at like 98 degrees, and he just fell asleep. It was one of the most shocking memories of those years to me.
Just a few days later, the band turned a concert in Hyde Park into a memorial for Brian.
He is not dead. He does not sleep. He has awakened from the dreams of life. It's we that are lost in stormy visions and keep with phantoms an unprofitable strife.
Brian was one of those people, as Keith has always said, he says, there's some people you know are not going to make 30. And Brian was the quintessential example of the 60s live fast, die young ethos. And he was the first of the high-profile drug casualty deaths.
I think that when they forced him out of the band, I think it was a great mistake, and I think it was unfair. After he left the band, a sound left with him that they never recaptured, and I don't think they ever tried to recapture. They went on to make pretty great music after Brian Jones left, but they never went on to make greater music.
The last few years had been a tumultuous time for the Stones, and following Brian's death, there would be more tragedy to come for the band, when the hopes inspired by the Summer of Love suddenly went terribly wrong.
On the next
By 1969, tragedy seemed to be in endless supply across the world. The previous year had seen the assassinations of both Martin Luther King Jr. and Bobby Kennedy. And the U.S. was stuck in the quagmire of Vietnam. The Stones had gone through their own tragedies, but seemed to be emerging even stronger.
One of the things about the Rolling Stones was that by actually starting to peak after the English invasion, they transcended it. The Beatles didn't live past the end of the 60s. The Rolling Stones were actually just getting going.
In July of 1969, the Stones went on a triumphant tour of the United States, where they declared themselves the greatest rock and roll band in the world. As the tour was coming to an end, they decided to stage a huge free concert to cap off their success.
Here was Mick thinking he was going to outdo Woodstock. So they said, yeah, let's cap off the decade and the tour with a free concert.
It took place on a December night at the Altamont racetrack outside of San Francisco.
They had this little stage about maybe 3 or 4 feet off the ground in front of this giant hill, which quickly filled with every high school kid in Northern California. And it was cold, and so bonfires were lit. They came with their big jugs of wine and lots of dope and acid.
And they hired the Hells Angels. It just looked grim from the start. There was no kind of regulation.
I think Santana opened, and then the Flying Burrito Brothers. And at one point, some Harleys got pushed over, and the pool cues came out.
The Hells Angels, well, they did some pretty horrible stuff. You know, they kicked people. They took any provocation as an excuse to hurt people. When the Stones took the stage very late at night, you know, they were already out of control of that situation.
The violence would culminate in the moment that would change the Stones forever and end the 60s dream of peace and hope.
I never saw anything like it. There's this black boy right in front of the stage, and he was with a white girl. And the Angels didn't like that to start with. And this angel kept pushing him. And finally, he reached in this green suit he was wearing and pulled out this revolver. And this angel, little bitty angel, jumped up in the air and came down with a knife and cut his jugular vein. It was a very frightening scene. I mean, I was scared to death, I don't mind saying. As Mick said, if Jesus had been there, he would have been crucified.
The stabbing victim, 18-year-old Meredith Hunter, bled to death in the crowd. And he was not the only person to die at the racetrack. 2 more died in a car crash, and another drowned in a trench used for drainage.
Four people died that night. Altamont turned into the anti-Woodstock. You know, instead of 3 days of peace and love, it was like, you know, a night of nightmares and death.
But what it was unveiling the dark side. And the Stones, who liked the dark side, who in a sense tried to make it artistic, got caught on the backwash.
They were never the same after that. They were never that band that spoke to the times. By the time that they acquired that reputation as the world's greatest rock and roll band, they were no longer the world's greatest rock and roll band. That died on the stage at Altamont.
Though they were world famous, the tough times for the Stones seemed to never end. In addition to Altamont, they were in litigation with their ex-manager Alan Klein, who controlled their finances. Though they would eventually regain that control, at the time they were broke. So in 1971, in order to escape Britain's extremely high taxes, the Stones decided to pack up and move to the south of France.
This quintessentially English band winds up in the south of France, living a totally debaucherous lifestyle with a studio in their mansion. They wind up whacked out of their head on drugs.
Ian McLagan was a guest in their villa and played keyboard in some of their recording sessions.
We cut Miss You and Just My Imagination, and that was a really fine time. Beds were made but weren't slept in, and meals were cooked, were occasionally eaten. It was a good time, and great records were made.
The Stones' new freedom, as well as their recent experiences, led to the album released in May 1972, many consider to be their best.
Exile on Main Street is maybe the greatest rock record ever made. That sense of debauchery is in there. It's beautiful and dark and everything you love about the Stones.
Keith Richards and Anita Pallenberg intensified their relationship and had 2 children by the time Exile was released. But despite being parents, their relationship was still built on decadence and drug use.
Keith was the ultimate outlaw, and Anita was his moll, you know, the ultimate junkie, decadent, drug culture couple. Keith, his drug indulgence at this point was pretty severe, and Anita, of course, was his enabler. They were completely living on the edge, shooting up, throwing the syringes under the couch, you know, just, you know, not cleaning up after themselves. You know, it was they were rock stars, they didn't clean up after themselves.
While Keith fell deeper into drug abuse, Mick pursued other interests. He had performed in 2 movies, Performance and Ned Kelly, and lived the jet-setting life of an international playboy. In 1971, he married a Nicaraguan model, Bianca Macias, and threw a star-studded wedding in Saint-Tropez. After Exile on Main Street, the Stones released 4 records, including classics Goat's Head Soup and It's Only Rock and Roll. But all was not going smoothly behind the scenes. In December of 1974, guitarist Mick Taylor abruptly left the band to pursue his own career. And since the band was headed into the studio to record their 23rd album, Black and Blue, they needed to find a replacement quickly. They chose Ronnie Wood of the band Faces.
At one point, I think he was just sort of a mate, and he went to record a solo record and recorded with Keith and I believe Mick. So when there was an opening, Ron Wood was a natural. I mean, he looked the part, and he kind of played the part.
Though the Stones had reached a new equilibrium with Ron Wood, Keith was about to receive one of the most severe blows of his life. During this time, Anita and Keith had a 3rd child, Tara. Tragically, he died just a few months after being born, and Keith's drug use spiraled out of control, leading to a low point when the Stones were in Toronto.
The Rolling Stones were going to make another album, and they couldn't get into the United States because of Keith's drug problems. So they went to Toronto, and eventually the police came in and busted Keith. Famously, he was asleep when the cops came in, and he couldn't be roused. He was in a coma. And so they hauled him up to his feet and started slapping him around. People say, who know them well, say that this was really the end of the road for Keith and Anita.
Keith needed to clean up his act. To kick his addictions, he would have to break up with Anita, who encouraged the worst of his habits. And in 1980, they separated. Mick was also newly single. He had separated from Bianca the previous year and was often seen in the company of model Jerry Hall. As Keith was getting clean, he began to assert control in the studio, leading to clashes with Mick, who was used to getting his way. By the early 80s, the Stones were entering the worst decade of their career.
They did a big world tour in 81, 82, and then everything stopped. The Rolling Stones didn't play on stage together for another 7 years. Mick Jagger started his notorious solo career, and Keith Richards was mad as hell. So eventually, Keith started his own solo career. Basically, there were no Rolling Stones in the 80s.
It looked as though the Rolling Stones' 20-year run as young, sexy, anti-establishment rebels was over. The band was set to quietly fade away, unless they could find a way to reinvent themselves.
Only on Bio.
The 1980s were not good for the Rolling Stones. Though Tattoo You in 1981 garnered decent reviews, their albums Undercover and Dirty Work were perceived as weak. Mick Jagger and Keith Richards were arguing and had started solo careers. But alone, neither had found the success that they'd had with the band.
It wasn't until 1989 that the Rolling Stones were able to come together again.
1989 was the year that the Stones were inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. And at the ceremony, Mick and Keith began to warm up to each other again. They put aside their differences to record another album.
By the late 1980s, the Stones had rediscovered a bit of their inspiration, and Steel Wheels, which was the impetus for an enormous tour, yielded Mixed Emotions, which most people thought was one of the best songs they'd done in probably a decade. So that recharged the batteries a little bit. It got them back on the road.
As Keith said, the Stones were bigger than the individuals involved.
After 27 years, the Stones had become an institution and were no longer the rebels of their youth.
It's a different world for rock and roll. I mean, the Stones were one of the first bands to accept major corporate sponsorship. They had a tour that was sponsored by Budweiser. You can go to their shows now and get a Rolling Stones credit card.
Stadiums, a crew of 200, 12 or 13 or 14 people on stage, a horn section, backup singers. You know, that's what the Rolling Stones basically are still today, 20 years later. They're a giant corporation that can spin billions of dollars out of some musical notes whenever they choose to go back on the road.
It ain't the same.
It was a sign of how far they had come when in 2003, Mick was knighted by the Prince of Wales at Buckingham Palace.
Prince Charles tapped Mick Jagger on the shoulder with his sword and dubbed him Sir Mick. And Keith Richards just went ballistic and said, you know, these were the people who were trying to put us in prison who, in 1967 when they busted us, and now you're accepting a knighthood? I mean, how lame is that?
People have been saying someone from such a famously anti-establishment band is now picking up a knighthood. How on earth did that happen?
I don't really think the establishment as we knew it ever exists anymore.
Mick's knighthood, I think it's what he's always wanted. If Mick had never got into music, I think he may have been an apt candidate for politics. And Keith, on the other hand, would think it was bollocks and could care less about it. You know, it's like the last thing in the world he wanted. To be respected by that part of society was not important to Keith. I think just the opposite is true.
Of all the Stones, Keith Richards seems to be the most indestructible.
I did an interview with him once when he brought in a large bottle of Jack Daniels, I mean like half gallon, and he just kept pouring glasses and drinking them. And he didn't seem any different from the person who first sat down.
I don't think it's a surprise that Keith is still around. He's a survivor. He loves to play. I think in the end of the day, no matter what state he's in, he'll pick up that guitar and chop out a few chords. With Keith, there's never been any question that he likes to have a good time, but he's in it for the music.
Today, the Stones are not the raw force for cultural transformation that they once were.
Well, at this point, the Stones are really not a creative force. They've released a few studio albums in the past decade that were okay.
Despite the fact that the members are in their 60s, the band continues to tour the world.
In the 2000s, the Stones became the preeminent touring band in the world. You know, at this point, the Stones are one of the few bands that can truly fill a stadium anywhere, any place, anytime. That's something that their contemporaries can't do. The Who can't do that, and there aren't really many other bands from that era still around playing. They've outlasted all of their contemporaries, playing the same great music that they have been playing for 40 years.
Mick and Keith, you know, the principal members, are alive and well. And there's not many 60s bands you can say that of.
The Rolling Stones have survived decades of rock and roll living and show no signs of slowing down.
As long as they can physically go out and play shows, my guess is that they will do it. There's plenty of money to be made. I'm sure they're still interested. We'll just have to see how long their bodies hold up.
Punk pushed a lot of people out. You know, hip-hop pushed a lot of people out. The Stones never got pushed out because they've always held their own. And they still tap into that core voodoo of, you know, blues and rock and roll that they loved. Jagger brought a lot of his wit and charisma, and Keith made sure they kept it honest.
Their very longevity makes them important as a band. They've kind of rewritten the rule book. Rock bands weren't meant to do that. They're the first one that have done it.
As a live act, they are always relevant. As a band that can get up there and do like 2 hours, no one's ever really topped them.
The playing of music is never confined to how old you are. It's just how much do you believe in it. The reason you get up there night after night is because you love it. That's what satisfaction's about. I can't get no satisfaction because I know that no matter how much I get from tonight, tomorrow night, I'm gonna want to re-up it.
I think in some ways they're a better band now than they were in the 80s, certainly than in the 90s. They show how you can age with music and still be a great band. They are a great band. They play as people with history, as a language between them, as a way of communicating. They remain a band that's a testament to how rock and roll itself endures.
Whoa.